A very good afternoon to all of you. Before we begin, I want to apologize as we were unable to conduct this session on 15th of November because of some technical issues. Now things are sorted and we are good to go. So yeah, we are back with the second last episode of our series on product management with SAP. Today's topic holds a lot of importance and it keeps the organizations on toes all the time. Acquiring a customer and then retaining it has never been easy and requires continuous efforts and innovative ideas to keep moving upwards. Aditya Trivedi, who is Senior Director and Head at SAP Innovation Labs, will share his experience and knowledge on this significant subject. You can ask, rather, write your questions anytime during the session, and Aditya will cater to them after his presentation. Also, provide us your feedback to help us improve the future sessions. It won't take more than 30 seconds. So, over to you, Aditya.
Thank you so much, Ankita. Thanks for introducing. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to this webinar, third last in the series of the product management learning that we initiated with NASSCOM. Today's topic is around customer acquisition and retention. And before I begin the topic itself, I'd like to kind of highlight that this is essentially uh, looking at the customer acquisition and retention perspective more from a product management point of view, which means that a lot of ideas and things that while we are sharing from a product marketing or a customer acquisition retention perspective, there are elements of product management around user experience and the UX strategy, which will get embedded as we kind of go along, and we look at it. I would propose that we look at it holistically from combining the voice of business, the voice of customer, and the voice of market. Now, and I'm going to use a very simple framework to basically highlight that covers the broadest possible audience in that sense. So in terms of expectations, this essentially covers the basics of customer acquisition and retention. Of course, we can cover more ground during the question if something is not kind of really covered in what I present. Moving on, uh, before I move on, these are legal disclaimers from NASSCOM. This series is, as I'm sure you would have seen the slides a couple of times. This series is solely for educational purposes and not intended to be replacing any other expert opinion or on any specific issue. And the whole idea behind this series is to disseminate knowledge for a greater good for the products ecosystem. Uh, and this is only for NASSCOM members. And there's a legal disclaimer from SAP. Moving on, while Ankita already spoke about what I do, I'm currently heading the SAP Co-Innovation Lab, where I engage with SAP's ecosystem, partners at large, and the startups and customers, where we do co-innovation projects in a product consulting mode on a plethora of technologies. And some of the co-innovation projects that we're currently running span across artificial intelligence, VR, AR, robotics, machine learning, blockchain, and the whole host of it. And we have some very exciting projects which are kind of currently running at the Co-Innovation Lab here. Now, moving into the topic, as I said, I'll begin the topic by introducing a very, very simple framework where we start from the basics, and then, of course, we cover more ground during the questions. But broadly, from a knowledge perspective, we're going to cover six broad points, which is we look at what really is customer acquisition, what are customer acquisition costs, what are the elements of customer acquisition cost, what are the different ways in which they can be impacted, because this is one of the key metric, though not the only one. Then we look at how do we improve the customer acquisition strategy. What are some of the existing methods that are leveraged in acquiring new customers? Uh, what really are the differences between customer retention versus acquisition? Is customer retention the new customer acquisition? And then we look at a lifetime value that a customer brings to an organization from a product perspective. Now, in if you look at now, in the last 5 to 6 years, 5 to 7 years, the cost of acquiring customers have really increased by over more than 50%. And marketing and the whole idea behind customer acquisition is becoming more and more expensive. Customers are becoming less trustworthy of brands, and there are more resources required or investments required from that perspective by companies. And the moment we talk about more investments being required on behalf of the companies, that means the strategies that are being used need to be refined and much more rock solid for companies to be acquiring these new customers. Now, if you look at ways of improving the customer acquisition, pretty much every company which is building products and taking to the market would actually be doing that. Now, reducing the cost of customer acquisition and improving the ROI of marketing efforts at a very core are the two most commonly quoted marketing priorities. And these two are the most common, how should I say, metric or mechanisms that are quoted by product marketing, product management in the context of customer acquisition and customer retention. Now, so when you so let's look at the entire process that I just kind of highlighted in a very in a single slide here. If you look at customer acquisition, fairly straightforward process of acquiring new customers or clients to your business with an intent to create um, systematic, sustainable uh, uh, acquisition strategy that can evolve with new trends and changes. Now, these new trends and changes can be driven by various factors in the industry. One could be technology, which we are anyway seeing right now. Then to be able to identify the right differentiators. If you really ask, uh, is technology a differentiator today? From my perspective, no. Because if you go to any organization, whether it's a large entity, enterprise, or whether you talk about a startup, uh, technology is something that pretty much every one would have access to, and everyone would have resources to be able to build those products or services using AI, ML, blockchain, whatever you name it, and you would find a lot of it is there in the open domain of open source as well. So to really understand what is it that will give you a differentiated strategy to be able to acquire customers, to be able to differentiate and stand out in the market. Customer acquisition would be important to any business, whether it's a startup or an enterprise. And of course, at the very core of it, the whole idea is to be able to make money, pay employees, reinvest in growth, and show the evidence. And more relevant in the case of startups would be to show the evidence of traction for outside parties, such as investors, partners, and influencers who are stakeholders in that business. Now, to be able to systematically attract and convert new customers would be the top priorities of any business entity. And I'm using the term business entity commonly, whether you talk about an enterprise or a startup. Though these strategies that each of these would use or deploy would differ depending on the context, the market, geography, and and the product line and all those kind of things. Now, at this point, a question might come up, what's the difference between lead generation and customer acquisition? So let's kind of break that down. Now let's visualize a customer journey from a business perspective in the form of a funnel, right? And there is a broad end of the funnel and there is a narrow end of the funnel. And consumers, from a marketing perspective, when an entity reaches out to customers, they would see those consumers moving through that funnel as a part of their journey towards becoming a buyer of the product, right? Now, how would that start? That would begin with an awareness of your brand. And that's why investing in branding strategies and finding the right brand, right messaging, the way customers, really view as the internal and the external understanding of the brand should be very, very concrete. Then, then once the buyer of your product or a service, when they're looking to solve the problem, and to solve that, when they look at evaluating your product, the product and the service that you're offering has to become a part of their consideration set. or a consideration pool, which means that if they're evaluating your product and service along with a few others, it has to become a part of that pool. And then towards the end, when the customer is actually making a purchase decision, a decision to buy or invest in your product or a service, uh, that is when they become a paying customer. So this is essentially the customer's journey through the funnel from the broad end to the narrow end. Now, if you really simplify and break it down further, lead generation would typically happen at the broader end, wherein they're acquiring knowledge via blog, social media, or any marketing or advertising efforts, and the customer outreach efforts or any other mechanism that you use to be able to reach out to them. The acquisition, the lead acquisition, in that sense that uh, you are part, sorry, your product or service is a part of their consideration set, is when the lead acquisition is really happening. And the conversion happens when you are able to convert that consumer for him to move your product from consideration set to having made a purchase decision. So this essentially is how the entire funnel would look like. Now at the now if you really break it down into lead generation and acquisition, we're looking at it here in a combined way, because conversion typically would require more dedicated, customized methods in converting, customers, such as lead scoring and closing, deal closure, and things like that. And then for them to become promoters or detractors, depending on their experience, the overall experience with the product or the service that they would have kind of purchased. So the whole idea is that we convert strangers and visitors by attracting them. Then we convert those visitors into what would you would call them as leads. Then we move the leads to customers, which is when we would kind of close. And then when you keep them engaged and convert the customers into promoters, is when you would create those delightful experiences. Now keep this flow in mind uh, as we talk about. Um, uh, as we talk about, because this is where customer retention will start becoming important. And later in the in the later slides, I'll talk about how the customer retention is almost equivalent to customer acquisition. Right now, let's move on to talking a little bit about customer acquisition cost. What is it really? It's simply put, it's a cost in bringing a new customer or a client to your business. And customer acquisition cost is important because it assigns a real value to your marketing efforts, and it allows you to measure the returns that you would get on the investments that you've made. And this is one of the metric that you would hear pretty much everybody on the business side of your the customer facing side of your business. And this is one of the most important metrics that are inquired by CEOs, managers, investors, pretty much alike. Now, how would you calculate this customer acquisition cost? It's very simple. At a very high level, you divide the marketing costs with a specific campaign or an effort put in by the number of customers acquired from that campaign. As simple as that. But if you really want to do a drill down, then you would actually club a lot of these costs towards the marketing side, which include wages, the investment that you've made in software. And a good rule of thumb would also be to ensure that you do this for a specific period of time, for a specific window that you want to calculate this customer acquisition cost, because of seasonality and of various other reasons, because of which this can vary. Uh, and from my perspective, it's a little bit of a fickle metric, and ideally would not use this own number alone to evaluate your entire marketing efforts, because there are few things that can really kind of throw this thing really off. And a couple of examples on why I'm saying this. The idea is that you need to understand how often does your customer make purchases, right? Buying a car is very different than going to chai point and probably buying chai. Now what is it that would require customer acquisition in these two cases would be very different. different. So this is just one example. Then do your I mean what kind of products or services are you offering now? Do you spend money, or do you put marketing efforts that will pay off a little far in the future? Example of this would be that you do a campaign in Q3 of a given year, but they'll start paying it out only in the Q1 of next year. So in this context, you will not really see an ROI immediately, but you'll see it a little far out in the future. What does that mean? That will imply that your Q1 customer acquisition costs, if you calculate at that point in time, they'd be a little skewed. So these are just some examples of why you should not use this alone to measure your acquisition costs, and you would really need to bring in a lot of context on why you and what kind of methodologies you're using, and things like that. Um, and however, it still is a critical number to calculate and constantly recalculate when you acquire new customers or you use newer acquisition methods, which may vary in costs, right? Now, given that we've understood that customer acquisition cost is an important one, and there are many elements and many factors and contexts that would apply when you measure any of this, uh, one of the important metric would be to how to keep these costs low, because that impacts the profitability of the product or services that you're kind of selling or taking to the customers and all that. Uh, and how would you really do that? How do you really reach out to new audiences? How do you really kind of do better? Can you uh, make your positioning better? Can you make your messaging better? Can you really minimize the associated costs and all that? And depending on the outlook, it can be motivating or demotivating as well. Um, Now, some of the ways in which you can minimize the cost of acquiring these new customers would be improve your website conversion efforts. Now, at this point in time, I would say for all the digital products and that we're talking about that have digital interfaces and all these things, a very important aspect would be bringing in the element of user experience. And I'm not talking about UI alone, I'm talking about the entire user experience. And one example that I take is the famous $300 million button that Amazon introduced many years ago. Uh, and they wanted to kind of, they called it express delivery. At a long time ago, it was required that when the purchase was being completed, a registration process was something that a customer would need to go through. And when a lot of this data was analyzed and understood, the product managers there realized that a lot of customers are dropping off at the point wherein the registration is asked for before the customer is actually able to make a purchase. And then they ended up realizing that they are losing a lot of paid customers who can be converted at this point in time. And this is a very good example of user experience as well as of making changes to ensure that you convert your customers. When they did a study, they made the whole checkout process much simpler, and it was not required further, and the customer not required further to register anymore, but simply complete the checkout process and the sale. And over a period of time, when they measured the stats again, it ended up that that simple change resulted in additional 300 million USD of revenue for Amazon. So just one famous example, but this is where I tie the whole idea of creating very rock solid user experience with your ability to convert your website conversion efforts. The idea here is that how do you enhance your call to action? How do you ensure that your site is available, mobile and tablet responsive? How do you optimize landing pages and clean up the copywriting and things like that? How do you ensure that customers do not stop at any point in time during the entire buying process, right? Are there any glitches at any point in time which kind of negate the customer's experience and stop them from from converting? So this is just one example of that. Now, the other would be how do you the other would be boosting the value of your current customers. Um, This of course includes new product releases or upgrades and which customers would invest in and all that. User value can also skyrocket when they refer other customers or simply act as promoters. So here the whole idea is that you convert your customers into promoters for your own business. And then the whole idea is that to be able to adjust and optimize your entire customer acquisition strategy. Take some time to lay out the acquisition blueprint. Look at different methods and what are they costing you. Really, analyze each of them. For each of these, how do you cut back on your marketing spend or manpower or whatever elements of costs that you associate with a particular method of customer acquisition? um, you know the costs for specific channels can change or rise or decline and all that. How can you leverage these changes over a period of time? So these are some of the ways in which you should really look at methods of acquiring customers and how you can play around with them to be able to bring that thing really down. What are the cheaper channels that you can invest in and things like that? And this also is a reflection of how agile your strategy is in terms of adopting to the recent marketing trends and changes and all that. Now let's look at some of those elements of how do you enhance the customer acquisition strategy overall, right? Now, for growth, any business would need customers, whether you have 5 or 5,000. But having a rock solid roadmap for acquisition is something that should, be really built. And if I kind of, really put some adjectives or put some ways of defining it, it should essentially have four concrete things. It should be sustainable, which means that something that works in the long time. It means that the investments that you're making, whether it's money, time, human, anything, technology, whatever else, can be upheld for a foreseeable future. If you, for example, now you want to acquire new customers through a blog, you should have the tools and resources to ensure that your content is fresh. You should have the mechanisms to be able to measure what is the periodicity at which your content is consumed. Uh, it can bring organic growth for months and years to come. And the whole idea is that how do you keep investing in that channel and to be able to evaluate the effectiveness of this channel at different points in time, right? So this is just one way. Then it should be flexible, uh, uh, because people respond to these changes, um, as they are kind of always changing trends or events that might end up disrupting preferences, tastes, and things like that. Earlier on, salespeople were the only gatekeepers of information about a product, but that is not true anymore. And if you really look at the moment of truth, so there's this concept called zero moment of truth, wherein even before the customer is actually visiting your channel or visiting you, he would have already made immense amount of research to be able to figure out and would have done all the research to be able to figure out where does he stand with regards to the product or the service that he or she is looking at. And that creates trouble from a product management, product marketing perspective, because consumers, when they hit your product or service channel, digital one especially, they would be skeptical of your brand claims and anything that a company or a representative would end up saying. Which means, so now on the one hand this is detrimental, on the other hand it opens up another channels for you to engage, which means to be able to create an ecosystem of advisors, which could be family, friends, or ecosystem at large. So those are some of the new opportunities that kind of evolve as you want to enhance your acquisition strategies. uh, Only relying on salespeople, unless and until it's highly specialized, would not be something that one should go for, which is what we mean by keeping it flexible. Then coming to targeted, your consumers, all consumers will not be the best ones, and your customer acquisition, if you go after the wrong set of customers, it would result in a waste of resources if you don't leverage towards the right set of customers of your products and services. And the whole idea is to be able to find those right ones. Before you invest in any of these acquisition methods, you must define who you are targeting with these said methods. And again, I'm bringing in the entire user experience and defining the buyer personas to weed out the unnecessary acquisition efforts, as well as becoming alert or becoming aware of specific needs or desires that some channels may meet. Here again, yeah. And so, for example, if you want to create or if you target millennials, right? You might consider creating how they can. You might it'll be very useful exercise to understand how do the millennials for your product consume content, and what are the right channels to be able to reach out to those sets of users, and really playing a mix and match of all of these. And the whole idea is that you take a step back, figure out what's best for that particular channel in terms of business resources and the audience, and then you would start to see changes and differences being made to the entire effort behind acquiring customers. And then it should be diversified enough. Here I'm talking about the omni-channel experience and acquiring customers via different channels that are available. Less, I mean, we can talk about the digital channels, the physical channels. If you take an example of a bank, there are various ways in which you can, the users, the customers can reach out to them. They can go via a physical branch. They could visit via the mobile app that the bank has. They could go via the website, the IVR engagements, and all those things. Now, how unified or how consistent or how good the customer's experiences across all of these channels would also help you determine which of these channels is kind of most effective. Quite often, it's in some cases you might find that the responsiveness of a website is much better compared to an IVR, because probably the salesperson or the audience behind the salesperson behind the IVR is not as responsive or as effective as do it yourself via the website. All this data, when you actually analyze, you would understand the effectiveness of each of these channels, and to be able to invest right kind of resources either in training if that particular channel is strategically important for you. And here again, I'm bringing in the element of user experiences to be able to understand your users in depth, what kind of channels they consume, what segments do they belong to, how to optimize those specific channels to be able to create a more effective acquisition strategy uh, for your customers and consumers. Now let's move on to how would you acquire new customers, which is step 3 of that simple diagram which I started this presentation with. Now you can break these methods into a variety. It could be paid, free, inbound, outbound. The best methods for your business, however, depends on your audience, resources, and the overall strategy that you've formulated. Um, let's look at maybe a couple of them for acquiring new ones. The whole idea is that these are used in different combinations uh, depending on the scale and the audience, and how what kind of mix do you want to have. One would be use content marketing to acquire customers. It's a very effective method for all types of businesses, creating new exciting relevant content that is consumable in bite-sized chunks. Because as you would see, if you look at statistics in terms of the attention span, uh, a very interesting study said the attention span of a goldfish was about 15 years ago was about 9 seconds, and the attention span of a human being at that point in time was about 13 to 15 seconds. 15 to 20 years down the line, which is more recently when this was done again, the attention span of humans has gone down to about 8 seconds, and the attention span of a goldfish continues to be at 9. So this is just a interesting tidbit in terms of how the attention spans are changing in terms of defining your content and how they'll be consumed. And when you look at a world of all kinds of claims being made, impacting customers' trust, uh, content marketing actually allows you to articulate your position better, share your expertise with your customers. And there really is no wrong or right type of content that you can create, but the whole idea is to be able to pay attention depending on the audience that you're trying to serve, the channels that you're engaging them with over, and the resources that you would need to create, and how consistently are you able to do that. And it could be, all video, audio, whatever channel your audience find most relatedness with. Next would be, blogging. Of course, we know that all. Blogging is a highly recommended method for all sizes, industries, businesses, and different audience types. It allows you to explore different topics from different perspectives. Here, I take an example of, football in the sense, or a ball, in the sense that you're able to, when you turn it around, you're able to offer different perspectives with regards to a product, or different aspects of your product or service to the audience or the readers who are actually engaging on that channel to understand your product or service better. It'll also allow you to engage in new opportunities and keep allow you to find out how engaged your audiences are. um, it can be bookmarked, and things like that, a question that they can answer, or questions that they can ask in comments, or you can introduce enticing call to actions that they can kind of engage with, and move forward from there. And again, here the question and the point, as I said above in the earlier slide, was it has to be sustainable. The content has to be fresh. It has to be live. Nobody would want to go to a dead resource and find out. No active consumer or customer would want to go to a dead resource and find out uh, things which are not, most up to date and things like that. You can engage employees, dedicated employees, freelancers, or guest writers to be able to kind of ensure that it has a consistent and a good user experience overall. Also, from a UI perspective, that it engages visually along with the content, and things like that. Then creating books, ebooks, guides, and content offers would be another way to acquire these new customers. Not bombarding, but creating specific resources that are consumable easily, downloadable. They can be reused for the production process, and ensure that they create or the right message, or carry the right association with the customers whom you are trying to reach out to. And then, of course, video, though complicated and expensive to produce, but one of the very effective ways to engage would be the video production. Of course, it requires a lot of script writing, editing, production, animation, and all that. But it is one of the best ways to engage, create a more liveliness to the overall engagement with your customers. Then, of course, there is social media and different channels that are available to be able to create right kind of awareness. Uh, Now, um, a couple of others as well include using search marketing to acquire customers. Uh, how do you really structure the content that you are presenting? Uh, and then doing a little bit of experimentation and mixing up, trying variety of customer acquisition methods, so that your audience can learn better from different perspectives and things like that, right? In addition to this, of course, email marketing is another very important channel. But here, the whole idea is not to, bombard, or still important, but to keep the message concise and the right set of audiences. Now, while we have spoken about acquiring the new customers, and how do you leverage to the audience that you want to reach out, what kind of resources you want to leverage, and the overall strategy as such, let's look at understanding uh, customer acquisition versus customer retention. In my perspective, this is something that is becoming really, really more important, because if you look, and if you remember at the beginning of the slide, I said over the last 5 to 6 years, it is 50% more costly to acquire new customers compared to retaining them. And one of the big reasons is that there is a churn that will always keep happening, where a percentage of customers will actually leave for different offerings by opting out of your existing products. But the whole idea is that let's look at churn in a different light, and let's look at retention being the new acquisition. in the sense that when you are deploying your resources and investments towards acquiring, uh, we can alter these methods to ensure how can you end up retaining them. A couple of examples in the enterprise world would be, how do you create? So, for example, if you are in a platform, if a technology platform sales or technology platform that you're trying to sell, then how can you make the platform more relevant or consumable for your customers by helping the customers understand how they can leverage the platform for new innovation, for extending what they already have, for connecting with the existing set of technology that they would already have and things like that. Now, this is also this is something that is common both in enterprises and startups. Of course, much more costly for startups, because then uh, the cost or the message that it also kind of comes sends across is a reflection of often on the product or the service itself. But the whole idea is not to lose heart. And customer churn would typically be a percentage of those customers who will peel away from your business or opt out for other products or services. I mean, you also call it attrition and turnover and all that. Why is this important? Because it motivates you to find and acquire new customers. Um, Businesses have experienced higher churn rates. They've invested more and more expensive acquisition methods, and it may not be necessary to do that all the time. It can be, it may be a time to look at uh, the whole idea of customer acquisition and churn in a new light. So instead of providing the band-aid of customer acquisition and let's go to this really the source of the wound, whether their customers are unhappy, whether they are dissatisfied, or is there something else that impacts them, or results in a decision for them to leave the existing service. And instead of looking outward and onward for new customers to replace the ones who leave, or the old ones, the forgotten ones, the whole idea is to keep the customers engaged and to retain them using newer and improved customer service methods, which means that your whole focus should be balanced well, or moving towards customer service more than new customer acquisition alone. If you remember, I briefly spoke about the marketing funnel, where at the broader end you would talk about the awareness, and then in the middle you would talk about acquisition, and then towards the narrower end, we are looking at the conversion of a customer from a prospect to a paying customer. And it's a different decent visualization of all that. But what is missing in that approach would be, how do you keep your customers uh, fuel the future ones, which means how do you engage your existing customers to ensure that the future ones kind of sign up and all that. And which means that you'll have to look at a different way of looking at customer retention versus customer acquisition, which means your entire strategy of service marketing and sales should circle around like a flywheel with customers at the center, instead of looking at them as an afterthought, right? And you would find this strategy gaining ground more and more, that customer at the center of our business. And this is essentially a reflection of what I just said, that the costs of marketing have gone significantly high in the last 5 to 6 years, and customer retention is the new way of ensuring that the customers are there with your product or service for a longer period of time. And it also reflects the momentum that you gain when your entire strategy revolves around a given customer. uh, you work towards retaining instead of paying to replace the lost ones. It's as it's as simple as saying that. Now, I will again tie this thing to another thing which I said a little while ago, is that if you look at the ways of differentiation, technology is no more a differentiator. Then what is? I would say user experience is the new differentiator. And when I say user experience, I don't mean UI alone, or the visual or the design aspects of it alone, but the whole methodology or mechanism that a company, an enterprise, whether it's a startup, would deploy to understand its customers on an ongoing basis, its users on an ongoing basis, and keep them engaged, and keep and retain them, which means you uh, define strategies of retaining them from all perspectives and not look at them in isolation or as an afterthought. And which means that from a product management perspective, the whole idea of customer retention and customer acquisition starts far early than when the product or service is being introduced in the market. And this begins right at the time when you are actually talking to your users, talking to your or interviewing your end users and customers to be able to understand them better in their own contexts, where they operate or in their own environments. This gives you an insight into what is it that really drives those customers with regards to solving a problem that your product or service promises to do. And this is, in that sense, a genesis of acquiring customers far out when the product or a service is out there in the market for customers to consume, right? um, and as we all know that retaining customers would be much costing much less than the acquiring new ones. New ones can cost up to 25 times more depending on the context, the audience, the environment, the kind of product that you're saying, the geography, and things like that. Excuse me. And there are multiple ways in which we can look at customer retention strategies. So if you look at just in terms of numbers, 5% increase in retention efforts can result in a likely revenue increase in the range of 25 to 95%. 90% happy customers likely to purchase again, which means that there's an ongoing engagement that you should have with your customers or users. 93% users are likely to be repeat, depending on how good your customer retention strategies or how well do you deploy your customer retention strategies as, right? Some of the ones I'm listing, this is listing some of them. How do you inspire and engage your customers? How do you create convenience for them? When I talk about inspire with a mission, right? Start with why you basically ask a very detailed question in that sense. Okay, the reason behind why. uh, Typically this is where social startups or social enterprises would actually begin inspiring with a mission. Many enterprise companies are also kind of getting into purpose driven marketing, where they more inspire and engage instead of just kind of sell. Then it could be empowering customers with convenience that you offer. You can innovate with marketing and really offer them convenience. Leverage personalization. uh, Speak to your customers. The whole idea is how do you engage them across different channels. And I am again touching this, connecting this back to the previous point which I made, that across different channels, the experience that the customer has must be consistent and responsive. And this again goes back to defining the entire user experience, which is why, from a product management perspective, user experience is supremely critical, and in my experience as well. Then you look at gaming and gamification and referral programs. Um, how do you engage and gamify the whole experience that the customers have? Then, of course, differentiate. You create a divide between you and your competitors. Here, the whole idea is that you offer your product or service to that aspect of the customer which is not being looked at by your competitors, either in positioning or in offering or in the problem that it solves, which again boils down to the fact that how strong from a product management perspective your entire user experience strategy is, and how well you engage with your user, how well do you understand your end users. Then subscriptions overall to bolster the experience. I think that's how Amazon Prime kind of started. How do you engage, how you can begin is don't charge a fee for subscription, but more to gain customer loyalty. is a program that has been tried and done very well by a lot of these companies that we come across very commonly. Then if you would see how do you use experiences to promote positive feelings, you would see an advertisement going around Coca-Cola when they talk about making friends, right? How can you think of promoting these positive feelings and leverage the experience? uh, Many in the enterprise space, many in the learning space, you capitalize on social proof, or leverage the word of mouth, and also on how do you educate the users or educate your customers. What are the different options that are available? How they look at your competitors? How they can look at solving the problems differently? And of course, then surprise and delight from a customer engagement and customer retention perspective, and finding the right choice of platforms and appropriate messaging to customers. This again from an omni-channel perspective, finding the right set of platforms and identifying the right kind of audience, who are the ones who are going to be most likely using that particular channel, and making an appeal to them either in positioning or reaching out to them. I took an example of the bank and a little while ago, wherein I spent that understand what kind of customers. So in that example, the whole idea would be to understand what kind of customers would actually visit a branch, what are their user profiles, what are those kind of personas that you can create. For the same bank, who are the ones, which customers are more likely to reach out to them via the uh, website, which are the customers who are more likely to reach via an app, which are the customers who are more likely to reach via an IVR or telephone response, and really craft experiences for those segments to engage them and to ensure that they get the right kind of messaging across the channel of their choice, which also goes a long way to say um, how responsive you are towards your customers in that sense. uh, then coming to customer lifetime value, and the whole idea is turning regardless of how you plan to retain, uh, one common denominator which is coming across would be how do you create an amazing or a phenomenal customer experience. And in my perspective, this is an absolute non-negotiable. Whatever mechanism or a method or a platform or you use, this is something that the whole idea would be to really provide much more than basic customer expectations to ensure not just retention but a continued engagement of a customer over its entire lifetime. Now, if you look at customer lifetime value as a definition, it's essentially a net profit or a business that a customer will provide over until he or she continues to be a paying customer, and that's an estimated net profit. And you can calculate the lifetime value. It's not difficult, but it requires in defining a few metrics along the way: average purchase value, frequency. You have to estimate these numbers. Having a rock solid customer LTV can help you predict how much revenue can you roughly expect from a customer. I think this is something that you can, as an example, you can, if you look at your own orders that you make online, and you would simply see a summation of your orders over a period of time, is something that is a reflection of what an LTV might look like. And so by defining the customer lifetime value alongside your customer acquisition costs, you can figure out how long does it take to replace each investment made in acquiring new customers, and how to better spend that acquisition budget, whether you really want to go for new acquisition strategies, or do you want to focus more on retention and things like that. So in a nutshell, customer acquisition and retention is essentially what a company would kind of survive. This is not something that uh, you cannot afford to give up on marketing to new customers, but also focus or craft your strategies around retaining them. And this is not just the job of product marketing services, or whatever marketing organization in your this thing is, but whoever has a touch point understands the users in that much more depth, whether it's sales, customer service, and how well do you really understand your users and customers. And companies who often succeed are those are the ones who will put their customers in the spotlight for both acquisition and for the retention as well. So the whole idea is that set up the acquisition strategy correctly. If you do that right across different channels, not only will you lower the acquisition costs, but also enhance your lifetime value of the customer till the time the customer continues to be a paid. And it's all about acquiring right customers who are around and help you acquire more by becoming promoters of your product and service. And the whole focus should be on how do you convert these customers and consumers towards becoming promoters or the positive evangelists of your product. And again, in a nutshell, looking at customers as a centerpiece of your business or product or a service that you are um, you know uh, mm, uh, centerpiece of your product or a service that you're offering. And the whole idea is to make your customers succeed. So that's in a nutshell uh, that I had to talk about customer acquisition. Uh, Customer acquisition. Thank you. Uh, and we can take questions now.
All right, Aditya, thank you so much. I guess you are able to look at the questions.
Yeah.
Yeah,
One
so
sec. One sec.
or you want me to read them?
Anita, yeah, if you can really help me with them, then maybe I can.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, please.
So let me read the first one. It's a little big question. So it is, what is the correlation between customer acquisition cost and profitability? I understand that the overall cost may get high, but what if this increased cost is resulting in increased revenues? Are we still going to say that the customer acquisition cost is hitting profitability?
No, customer acquisition cost is not hidden profitability. Okay, let me offer a perspective on this. So the whole idea is that how much resources or money are you spending on acquiring a new customer? How much time does it take to move the customer from the awareness end of the funnel to the conversion end of the funnel? How much resources do you take to convince the customer to convert them to becoming a paying customer, right? And that essentially is the nature. So if you look at it at a unit level, so for example, if you're selling a product to a particular customer, and the cost of that, but and the say for example the price for that particular that you're charging to the customer is X, and you end up spending 40-50% of that in acquiring that, to that degree your profitability from coming from that customer would reduce, right? So a customer acquisition cost is something that is very important, and one of the important metrics, of course, I mentioned a couple of other things as well around it. So it needs to be looked at in context, but it is important to keep those customer acquisition costs down because that does impact profitability.
All right.
Yeah.
Thank you, Aditya. The next question is, if customer, again, I think it's the in continuation. If customer acquisition strategy is flexible, then higher cost may creep in, which may lead to less profitability. This in itself undermines the philosophy. Can you please clarify this?
Okay, so when I say flexible, I do not mean that. So now, if you look at just the information available, and if you look at the awareness end of the funnel, there are different ways the customers would have already spent in in understanding your product or a service that you're offering, uh, much before they even hit the place where they will want to buy uh, buy your product or a service, right? Now, if you don't keep it flexible, which means you want to stick to only one channel of offering, you may never probably come to know which is the one which is more effective. And this is something that you will come across only by experimentation. Here, the idea again, I'm going back to the bank. If you say, for example, say I'm only going to offer my services across a branch, sure, it is an expensive one. It involves real estate. It involves, ensuring that it is always manned. It involves that uh, it is always manned by the right kind of people with the right set of knowledge. Now you may end up figuring out that the kind of personas who are actually visiting a bank branch are not the are only a very limited set of your entire set of users, or the segment that you are trying to reach out to. So if you don't have those right channels in place, you would not never be able to figure out what are the new customers who you can or new segment who you can reach out to. It's quite possible that the bank might engage younger customers via, say, maybe an app or via their website and things like that. And the other thing also is that um, information is not limited anymore, and your customers are far more educated compared to the other times. And whatever claims your brand make, it'll always be, validated or questioned by customers much before they engage with you to buy a product or a service. So yes, initially it'll be expensive when you are setting up those channels or setting up your creating a flexible acquisition strategy. But you need to acquire right kind of data to be able to evaluate which strategy works for me at what point in time, across what channels, for what kind of users. And that's something that will take a little bit of time to master and understand in depth. But I believe that that's an important thing to do.
All right, Aditya, I guess this answers Rajat's question. The next question is, can you give an example of surprise and delight method?
Surprise and delight. Um, Something that comes to my mind. Surprise. So, for example, if you look at the recent ad from Coca-Cola, wherein you see a father and son, or maybe a younger guy and not a father and son, but a younger and a senior man sitting in a train, and he puts up Coca-Cola in the on the tray in the middle in between the two seats, and then he engages into a conversation about making them a friend, right? Now we know, or it is also known that aerated beverages are not the healthiest of drinks. They are loaded with sugar and all that. But if you look at that ad itself, it kind of creates a delight, and that puts those concerns aside for that time, right? So that's just one example of how you can surprise and delight your customers. It could also be that you surprise your customers with new offers, depending on the purchases that they would have made. You simply add maybe how do I say, discount coupons or coupons to their wallet based on the purchases that they made, which kind of keep them engaged, surprised, and delighted.
All right. There's this another question, which I guess in continuation with the first two question, Aditya. So it goes like this. It would be better to say consumer acquisition rather than customer, since customer is the subset of consumers who are attached or affinity to brand company. So for that brand or company, they are customer. Customer retention is important to them, right?
Correct. So what is the
All right.
question?
This is the question he's asked. I mean, like, probably he was just asking
It is
just
more a
your
statement.
information.
Yeah, yeah. So, okay.
Okay. So now the next question is, what one thing which really drives customer retention?
There is no one thing that really drives customer retention. My perspective is on the whole topic is this, that when you look at it from a product management perspective, understand understanding your user, understanding your customer in depth is really critical, and this process begins much before you introduce your product or a service in the market. Of course, you'll have to keep redefining it in an iterative manner, understanding them from different contexts. First, as users of your product, as somebody who's consuming your product and all that, and then somebody who would to pay you to consume that product or a service. So, if you ask me one thing, then I think a phenomenal user experience. Again, I'm reiterating, user experience is not UI, not design and all that, but really understanding your users in depth.
All right. So now, Aditya, looking at the time, so let's just take the last question and then
Yeah.
I guess we should wind up. So the last question is, what's going on in customers' mind when it comes to continuing to do with business with with a company? I mean, again, it's I guess the repetition of
So now, I mean, I can just offer a perspective. So, for
Yeah.
example, I mean, if you look at your own experience and if you're looking at a particular product, essentially you're consuming something to solve a problem that you might have. So, for example, let's take a problem of commuting. Now, you've purchased a vehicle and you commute from wherever you want to, say office to home or home to office and all that. How does this solve your problem? What are the alternatives that are available to you? How easy it is to kind of maintain your current product or a service? How easy does the company from whom you've bought this product or a service solves it for you, right? If there are variants available which are better off, then there is a motivation to switch. The whole idea is to be able to understand from a company's perspective would be what is it that is going on at a particular point in time. What are the alternatives that are available? So I think multiple things would go on in a customer's mind when you talk from a retention point of view, and the whole idea of the company would be to tap into those things and keep them engaged, which is far easier compared to a new customer acquisition.
All right. So I think we are good. We are done with the questions. There are a few more, but looking at the time, I guess we need to wind up now. So thank you so much, Aditya, for this wonderful session. I'm sure each one of you have learned something new, especially when Aditya explained why retaining a customer is as good as acquiring a new one. The efforts and the strategies put in for the same, it's tremendous. The way you covered all the important topics, explained them by giving examples was something great, Aditya. Thank you for the enriching points. As also he mentioned in the beginning that now there are only 2 sessions left from our product management series. Stay tuned. We will inform you with the details very soon. I will meet you next time on 27th of November on coming Tuesday with the next episode of our data science series. The topic is Enable Deep Learning with Applications in Healthcare by Dr. Sunil Kumar Vipulla, who is Principal Scientist and part of the leadership team in Philips Research India. So, till then, thanks all of you. Do leave your feedback. Take care. Thank you, Aditya, again. Thanks, all of
Thank you
you.
so much. Thank you everyone for
Thank you.
participation. Thank you for your time. Yeah. Bye bye.
Thank you. Take care. Bye.